Hello, and welcome to the webinar on how empowering customers to self-serve can assist in the challenges that many businesses are facing at the moment. My name's Steve Morrell, and I run ContactBabel, which is a contact center industry analyst firm. We carry out a lot of primary research to see what's going on in the industry, and I'd like to share some of this with you today, specifically around self-service. You'll be given copies of the presentation, so there isn't any need to scribble down notes. And you can download the full report, which is called the Inner Circle Guide to AI-enabled self-service for free, and we'll show you how to do that on the final slide.
Thank you, Steve. I just wanted to say a quick good morning from myself too. Good morning to everybody and welcome to our webinar. As Steve pointed out, we will be talking about self-service today, and in particular about what businesses can do very quickly right now in terms of limiting the impact to the current coronavirus crisis. My name is Astrid Pocklington. I'm part of the marketing team at Enghouse Interactive, and I will be your moderator today. Also from Enghouse Interactive is Jeremy Payne, who I welcome very warmly as one of our presenters this morning. Jeremy is our Group Vice President of Marketing and Alliances, responsible for the UK and Nordics region at Enghouse. And of course, it is my absolute pleasure to also have Steve Morrell from ContactBabel on board. Steve has already introduced himself, and before we dive in, just a few little housekeeping announcements. The webinar will be recorded, and afterwards I will be sending you links to the recording and the presentation. And if you want to ask questions, you can type them into the little question box that comes as part of your GoToWebinar control panel. And we will be addressing those questions either during the discussion or at the end. We will allow enough time for Q&A. And now, without further ado, I hand over to Steve.
Thank you, Astrid. So, first of all, let's dive straight in. I've got some brand new data that I'd like to share with you. It's a short survey done in association with Channel Doctors. And we looked at around 80 UK contact centres. It's only quite a small sample, but it gives a snapshot of how coronavirus is affecting their business operations, and some of it's actually quite surprising. First, we'll have a look at the effect on headcount there on the left. So we can see while 1 in 5 of the surveyed contact centres are furloughing some of their staff in order to reduce numbers, only 4% have actually laid people off permanently, and 18% say that they're actively recruiting new agents in order to cope with any extra work that they have. On the right-hand side there, unsurprisingly, there's been a massive move to remote working, with 84% of survey respondents saying that their agents have recently moved to mainly being based at home, and 13% say they're still working in a centralised environment. If we look next at absence rates and contact volumes, 19% of survey respondents say that they've got quite excessive absence rates in excess of 25%. But to be honest with you, this isn't a perfect question because it doesn't really differentiate between a previous absence rates of up to 25% and one where there hasn't been any increase in absence. So there's only so much you can really draw from looking at this, apart from the fact that 1 in 5 operations are definitely struggling badly with absence. And the final chart in this short survey, just on the right-hand side there, shows the changes in customer contact volumes. Now, I actually found this pretty surprising because it's split fairly evenly down the middle between those who've seen significant rises in volumes and those who've noticed a corresponding drop. Obviously, you've got the likes of luxury goods retailers and motor insurance claims departments, so they're likely to see a major tailing off in demand, whereas banks and online wine retailers, as I can verify as a customer, have tended to see quite the opposite. So we've got really 2 conclusions that can be drawn from this. So some contact centres which are experiencing higher absence rates and greater than usual call volumes will be struggling enormously to offer any sort of acceptable customer service experience. But there are also likely to be those contact centres which are pretty much mothballed until their customer demand rises again. This presentation will look at some of the ways in which the overworked and understaffed contact centres can hopefully begin to get more of a grip on their workload through the application of self-service. Please forgive any technical glitches. Right, so for any technology to be a success, it really needs to work for both the consumer and the business. And let's look first at the demand from the customer. This chart is taken from a survey of 1,000 UK customers that we did last year. So we asked these customers which channel they wanted to use for various types of interaction. So for example, high urgency, high complexity, high emotional status. And this chart is about the high urgency interactions. So we used the example of a simple but a time pressured interaction. So in this case, if the customer needed to pick up somebody from an airport, you remember those, and they needed to know if the plane was still on time. So if you like, it's a simple transactional query. So the agent is simply reading something off the screen rather than having to add value or do anything particularly complex. And perhaps not unsurprisingly, web self-service was seen as being by quite some way the #1 most chosen channel for this type of query. And the thing that's really interesting to me here is the fact that this is the case even with older demographics. Now, conventional wisdom might say, oh no, they won't want to use automation at all, they want to speak to somebody, but in fact, this doesn't appear to be the case at all. And for this, they're happy to use self-service. And the reason for that is that regardless of age group, socioeconomic group, anything that we've looked at, the most important factor driving customer satisfaction and customer experience has been shown time and time again in our surveys for many years to be first contact resolution. And this is something that, in this case, for a simple yet urgent interaction, web self-service is particularly capable of delivering. And people have learned that through their own experiences of being a consumer. And so this is something that they're more than happy to try self-service for, whereas perhaps for a highly emotional, certainly a highly complex issue, they're more likely to try other channels first. And I won't go through all of those, but they are there in the report if that's something of interest. So the conclusion we can draw from this is that if you have any high urgency interactions, then perhaps those are the ones you should look at dealing with through self-service. And that will give your agents a chance to focus on complex call handling and the other stuff that they can really add value to that's much more complicated, if not impossible to do through automation. That's customer demand. The second one, if we start to look at things from the business side of things, is profitability. So what you're looking at here is the average cost per transaction of various live channels in the UK. And these are the ones that are dealt with through agents rather than through automation. This is all live channels, or rather agents. It requires an agent. The big thing to take away here is that obviously you might expect telephony to be the most expensive channel, and you'd be right, but there's not a huge variation between that and email, web chat, or really social media either. And the reason for that is, as we'll see a little later on, is that most digital channels are actually still handled manually by agents. And there's generally a pretty limited use of automation or agent assistance, which does have a big impact on costs. And although we haven't researched these figures ourselves, we have seen estimates of cost per IVR session of between 25 and 50 pence, and cost per web self-service session is considerably lower. So obviously you're looking at very serious differentials there, which obviously impacts hugely on profitability. Let's have a quick look at the current use of various types of self-service. So this chart shows the current use of web self-service, touchtone, speech recognition, visual IVR, etc. And it's segmented by size of contact center. So small contact centers up to 50 seats, medium 51 to 200, and large is over 200. And you see there are significant differences there. So we've got general web self-service, so that's defined as the type of thing where anyone can access regardless of whether or not they're actually a customer, so they don't have to pass through security or authentication. That's the one that's most widely offered. And you've got touchtone and account-specific web self-service, and that's used by around half of survey respondents. Your mobile app is used a lot more by larger operations, as you might expect. And there's a minority using speech recognition, to a much lesser extent visual IVR, which has got great potential, particularly as close to 2/3 of calls now come through mobile telephony. And obviously not all of those mobile phones will be capable of handling visual IVR, but I just dug up some recent figures that show that around 80% of UK mobiles are actually smartphones, which would allow the kind of visualization of IVR menus and options and really make things a lot better. So it's worth spending a little more time looking at the reasons that self-service fail, because it's not applicable in every instance, but we still have to pick up the pieces when it doesn't work. So just over 1 in 5 calls come through from people who've tried web self-service already, but they haven't been able to achieve what they wanted to. So why is this? So we've asked this question to the businesses. And the main reasons for escalation from web self-service is that the issue basically requires an agent because it's too complicated for the customer to do online, or simply that the self-service functionality isn't available. Fair enough, you might think, well, there's not a huge amount we can do about that. Possibly that's just one of those things. It's it's just up to us to deal with it. Yep, absolutely. But if we also look at the fact that a fair proportion of escalations happen either because customers simply wanted the reassurance of talking to someone, or that although the web self-service functionality was actually there, they couldn't figure out how to use it, or they didn't have the for whatever reason they decided, no, we don't want to do that. Those are points of failure that can actually be addressed, and we can use customer journey analytics to find out where the problems are arising, and behavioral science to kind of understand how we can make things less complicated for the customer and how we can reassure them that their issue can be dealt with without them having to pick up the phone. It may also be a good idea to offer an escalation to a web chat rather than a phone call. This will kind of save the customer from having to break channel entirely, and it also gives you an option to pass through some of the history and context about what the customer's actually been doing, been trying to do, so that will help them and also help the agents as well. So staying with web self-service escalation, when they need to escalate from web self-service to another channel, how can they do it? Well, to be honest with you, it's pretty clunky at the moment in most cases. It might simply be a case of offering a telephone number and an email address, or even linking to a full website if they're only on a mobile-only website. And none of those things are particularly helpful from the customer's perspective. Really, any sort of history or authentication or context is going to be lost in those cases. So they will feel that, in many cases, it wasn't worth trying to use self-service in the first place. Now, giving them an email does allow the population of form fields, so you can give some sort of idea about what they're trying to do. And again, it doesn't really break the channel because they're still doing stuff in front of a screen. But as we're seeing a lot of recently, some of the response rates from email are getting back to kind of 1990s level of expectation. So it's like multiple days, if not weeks. So the customer really won't be reassured by that. And they're either going to ring the contact center and put your call volumes up, or they're just going to go elsewhere and you lose a customer. Now, we've got a minority of contact centers that are using click to call or click for web chat, which is much better because it's synchronous communication pretty much, and we expect higher resolution rates. And we got 15% requested using web callback request, which is useful for kind of managing environments that are highly spiky during the day, but much less so if there's consistently high levels of calls throughout the day, which many kind of crisis-ridden contact centers are experiencing. So that's something to bear in mind. We have a quick look at telephony self-service rather than the web side of things. The reason that people abandon self-service sessions, and it is a fairly similar figure to web self-service, about 1 in 7, 1 in 6, 1 in 7, that sort of thing. There aren't as many kind of very strong feelings about why this is from businesses. I mean, some mention the lack of user friendliness or speech recognition, or the customer doesn't trust the system. But in many cases, this is more to do with a customer's unfamiliarity with how to use the system. So, for example, they're using keywords rather than natural language, which usually works better with most modern systems today. But we do expect to see this improving as customers become used to talking to the likes of Siri and Alexa. And something that's very noticeable from our perspective is that a high proportion of large operations strongly believe there are too many options in their IVR for the customers, which is something we will look at next. So this chart shows the number of menu levels in touchtone IVR systems used by UK contact centers, and it's split by size: small, medium, large. So you can see there that very obvious that the larger operations, so those with more than 200 seats, have far more menu levels and also far more options overall in their IVR, as they'll tend to have more products, services, departments, places to go, things to do. And certainly either visual IVR or speech recognition could assist with this, make things a lot quicker and easier. Now, we have seen examples of IVR menus where it's possible for a customer to spend 2 or 3 minutes navigating through the option, and that clearly isn't great. So, and that's something we can do about that. And finally, just kind of moving on, I'd like to talk very briefly about virtual agents, or chatbots, artificial intelligence, call it what you will. Now, this chart refers back to something that I mentioned earlier, which was the very low levels of automation being used for digital channels, which means that those channels are only a little less expensive in the main than a live telephone call. At the moment, we have around 5% of web chat being handled entirely by AI stroke chatbots without any response from the agent at all. We've almost, interesting, we've got almost 3 times as many where the AI is suggesting answers to the agents and so kind of working alongside them. And the equivalent figure for email is somewhat less, certainly for the kind of working alongside the agent. But it's worth noticing the difference since 2015, where these figures were considerably lower, although obviously, you know, there are still major opportunities for businesses to extend the use of AI and really to kind of bring the cost of serving digital channels right down, you know, certainly much, much lower than a telephone call. And finally, just a very quick look at businesses' opinions of AI in the contact center in the future. So it's much more kind of an opinion thing rather than what they're actually doing. But the short version really is that AI is seen as augmenting agents, not replacing agents, certainly not in the short to medium term in any case. And there's an almost kind of unanimous feeling across the entire industry, regardless of size of contact center or vertical market or anything like that, that AI in the contact center will be of great importance in the years to come, and you know, very much so even in the short term as well. So thank you very much for your time today. We'll be taking questions later on. And the data you've seen here is from the Inner Circle Guide to AI-enabled self-service, and also from our most recent report, the Inner Circle Guide to Contact Center Remote Working Solution. And they are both available from the Enghouse Interactive microsite and also from ContactBabel itself. I'd now like to hand over to Jeremy Payne, who's the Group Vice President of Marketing and Alliances at Enghouse Interactive. Jeremy will be talking about specific pain points that can be addressed by introducing self-service, as well as the positive effect this will have on your customer experience. Over to you, Jeremy.
Thanks so much for that, Steve. It's a really insightful presentation, and really exciting that the data within it is just so up to date. You know, I think we're at that point in time, aren't we, where it's just literally, the word unprecedented is used a lot at the moment, but we really are in unprecedented times. And you know, some of the graphs and some of the findings were really interesting because some of them aren't necessarily exactly what you would expect. So some really good insights in there. And as we sort of move forward onto the next slide, you know, we can start to think about how some organizations have been handling this. And certainly some organizations have struggled. You know, I think it's probably fair to say that, you know, many organizations have been hit with that double whammy where their contact center has been overwhelmed with a huge increase in inbound inquiries. They've had staff go off sick. Many of them, you know, haven't got the organization properly virtualized. So I think in that kind of context, we've seen many organizations actually buckle under the weight of what's kind of going on. So yeah, it's definitely been a challenge, I think, for many organizations. If we start to think about how organizations are responding to that, I think what we start to see is, you know, a range of people rapidly looking to, you know, virtualize their contact center, bring more expert help into their organization. So some real challenges that are being addressed in many different ways. So I think probably at that point, it would be useful to hand back to Astrid and for us to run a poll and get your view on how your organization is doing it. And I think, as Steve pointed out at the start, it's not one size fits all. So this is really about your organization. How well do you feel, your organization is leveraging self-service and automated service? Over to you, Astrid.
Yes, thank you, Jeremy. The poll is already in full swing. I can see people voting. I'm gonna give it another moment. About half of our audience has voted already. I'll read out the question again in the meantime. Do you think your organization is well equipped to leverage self and automated service? You can select one answer, yes, no, or maybe. Okay, people are still voting, so let's wait another moment. Curious to see the results. Okay, let's stop this here then. And let's close the vote. And let's share the results. Okay, so most people have answered yes. Are you surprised by the result, Jeremy?
I am slightly surprised, because I think when we look at a lot of the organizations that we interact with, and I think when you looked at the graph that Steve showed in terms of the typical cost per interaction, I think what you're seeing is, whilst there's what appears to be self-service, there's a lot of still human intervention behind the scenes with that self-service. So it's not kind of fully automated, but and again, I think it does vary sector by sector. So many organizations, I think, probably do struggle a little bit more than others, and it does depend on what situation you're in. But I guess it would be interesting as well to get Steve's view on that.
Yeah, it's kind of something that I would kind of expect, to be honest with you, because a lot of this, while we're looking at what's happened in the last couple of months, we've got to remember that self-service strategy, customer contact strategy is something that's planned for kind of months, if not years in advance. So yeah, perhaps people are having to move things along a bit more quickly than they'd like to, but the fact is that this is self-service is a long-term strategy, and at the moment we've got kind of a short-term tactics. Some people are putting plasters on there to kind of get through and do what they will, but the likes of AI, for example, is something that is a multi-year thing, is never going to go away. And yeah, I think a lot of people will have given a lot of thought to their strategy, know where they want to go, and maybe they're having to move there a little bit quickly than they might have planned in the first place.
Good. Okay. All right. Well, I think with that, we'll then start to look at some of the options that are available to people and where we're seeing those used. So as we move forward onto the next slide, I don't know if you can all see the slide. But I think there's a whole range of different things that are out there for people to use, and it really is based on what's right for your organization. And I think one of the things that people need to kind of think about is that balance between digital by default and digital by design. So if you're, for example, a low-cost airline, you're probably more focused on things like a digital by default approach. So you want as many interactions as you can to go down a default road. If you're more, say, like a private bank and you're dealing with a high net worth individual, you're probably not going to want that person to self-serve that much, and you're going to want to take control of that customer relationship as much as you can. And I think one of the things, for some of the people that are on the line now, you're probably a giff-gaff mobile customer, and if you are, you'll be pretty familiar with that concept of social customer service, where the customers support and help other customers, and it's a hugely powerful thing. Steve's talked about, you know, chatbots, virtual agents, visual and conventional, you know, DMTF, IVR. You know, so there are a lot of things out there, and I think one of the things that's probably least kind of used at the moment is real kind of simple stuff like changing the web page, changing the comfort messages on your IVR, social media, proactive outbound notifications. Those kind of things can all really make a difference in terms of either helping the customer self-serve or deflecting calls. And I think as we move forward onto the next slide, you know, it'd be great to get your views in terms of the areas that you think within your organization from a self-service or automated service point of view would make the most difference. So I think we're going to move to our second poll now.
Yes. Okay. I've launched the next question, so it would be another great chance for you to provide us with some input. What are the self-service areas that you think can make the biggest improvement to CX and response times? The options that you could choose from, and in this poll you can select multiple answers, are email management, social media, FAQs and user forums, apps and bots, or IVRs. Okay, half of the audience has already casted their vote. Let's wait a little longer. Okay, let's close the vote and share the results. Jeremy, are you able to see the results?
Yeah, so I think
Fantastic.
I think, you know, that feels pretty consistent, and I think, you know, when we think about the research that Steve put forward, and we'll ask Steve his view in a minute, but it's interesting, the apps and bots bar graph looks pretty consistent, I think, with you know, what Steve was showing in his airline kind of web self-service kind of thing. We've also seen, I think, from our customers, you know, FAQ user forums is almost kind of like a no-brainer. We're seeing email management, you know, really grow as an organization. I'll talk about that in a second. But Steve, what's your view on that? Does that feel consistent with what you've seen from your research?
To be honest, that's what I was hoping would come up, because that's kind of what I believe in very strongly at the moment. You know, web chat and chatbots in particular are a, you know, way of taking out, you know, a fair old chunk of some of the simpler stuff. They provide synchronous interaction with the customer, which is very reassuring to them, rather than have to, even if they get the, you know, waiting 24 hours for an email response, you know, that's still not, it's not really ticking the emotion box there, whereas the likes of chatbots are doing that. And I think it's also worth noticing that most of those actually, you know, they will pull from the same knowledge base. So if you've got a clean, up-to-date knowledge base and somebody on top of that all the time, then all of those channels can, you know, pull the same consistent messages through there and really kind of, you know, support each other. I think one of the problems is when you've got, you know, different sources of information and they're siloed and they're not kept up to date properly, and one hand doesn't know what the other hand's doing. That's when, you know, self-service can kind of fall down quite a lot. So, you know, would emphasize the importance of having a single clean knowledge base available. Yeah,
agreed. I think you know, increasingly the knowledge base is the crown jewel of self-service, isn't it? So I think as we move forward to the next slide, we'll take a look at you know, a customer that we've been working with and how they're using email management, AI and bots to automate and deflect a lot of the need for human touch. And that customer is Montblanc. And, you know, many of you will be familiar with Montblanc making kind of expensive, you know, briefcases and pens and other stuff like that. And what they found when they actually analyzed their their inbound inquiries, what they were finding was there was an awful lot of, I guess, repeatable, predictable inquiries. So, you know, people kind of emailing in asking, you know, where do I find the replacement ink cartridge for XYZ model pen? And it's the same type of question again and again and again. And I think when you looked at the example that Steve talked about in terms of web self-service, AI and bots, this type of technology, the natural language understanding, natural language processing, using a knowledge management base underneath it all, lends itself very well to parameterized inquiries. You know, it costs quite a lot of money to maintain a database, and so the more parameterized it is, the more efficient and effective it will be. And in the case of Mont Blanc, they kind of looked and triaged and understood and analyzed all those inquiries and put in place an email management platform. And again, it's basically using artificial intelligence to read those inbound inquiries, read those questions that are getting posted within the web chat window, understand them. And it's exactly the same way as Steve mentioned, you know, Siri or Alexa on your kitchen worktop that you talk to, using that NLU engine to go off, find an answer, and then present it back either in a verbal or, in this case, an email templated form back to the customer to effectively help them self-serve without the need for a human intervention. And I think what was interesting when we looked at Steve's research, you know, just the impact of the volume of inquiries that people are getting when you present them with a massive hold time, you know, for the contact center. People then move to option 2, which is let's use the email. And as Steve mentioned, you know, some of the wait times people are experiencing on email right now is, you know, 5-7 days, which is not really what customers expect. So that ability to have pre-templated responses that can take away, you know, 60, 65, 70% of the inbound inquiries you were going to get, then starts to free up your human agents to deal with the stuff that they're really good at, which is that human emotion kind of piece. So as we move forward to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about mobile IVR. And I think most of you have probably parked a car in a UK town centre at some point in the last year. Quite when you'll be doing it again, none of us know. But probably the last time you did, when you went to pay, you didn't have £10 in pound coins on you, and you probably used your phone to pay for it. And most of those, you know, payments are ultimately processed by a company called Cobalt Telecoms, or you probably know them better as Ringo. But again, when you actually look, the thing that's really interesting about this story is just the volume of the percentage of the interactions that are processed, you know, through that automated platform. And actually, when you look at the two technologies that are primarily being used, it's IVR, conventional, you know, press 1, 2, 3 buttons on your phone, or visual IVR if you're using their app, which has sort of got our technology embedded within it. But again, I think sometimes some of the customers we speak to perceive that the technologies they need to make this type of stuff work are really expensive and sophisticated and complex, and it really doesn't need to be. I think when we looked at Steve's graph that showed the cost of some of these interactions, actually many of the companies we go and sit down with have already got these technologies, they just haven't got them set up right. And one kind of final point as we're talking about mobile IVR and any self-service, you know, platform or channel, is that one of the most important things to think about is building in the escape route. So as people get stuck, or it's taking too long, or they're struggling, or they typed in the wrong credit card number twice, what's the escape route to, you know, a human agent in a contact center or someone that can support and assist them? And in some cases, obviously building in some intelligence for it to be able to do that. And as we move forward to the next slide, we start to think about, you know, in this virtualized world, how do we fold agents in? And I think, you know, one of the things that many organizations have struggled with is that virtualization. Some organizations had already, you know, virtualized their contact center and customer service operation into a cloud, so working remotely, you know, was possible for some. But for many it wasn't, or for many, bits of it were and bits of it weren't. And we had a customer literally 10 days ago where we had to start from scratch and build them from scratch in 48 hours, a complete new virtualized contact center. So I think the conversation around the cloud and whether people should have their contact center virtualized or not has kind of been and gone. I think when this all blows through, most organizations, it will just be a given that every core system they need will be virtualized. And the great thing about a virtualized contact center is it allows agents to work from home and more flexibly. It allows you to fold people in from your broader organization if you need to scale a ramp quickly. And it also allows you to fold in people from other organizations, outsourced contact center operations if you need to, if you're experiencing a massive spike. So, I think that is a key part of, what the world is going to look like moving forward. And I think it will allow organizations to bring in more and more sophisticated people into customer service interactions. So as we think about self-service and automated service processing a lot of the routine and parameterized stuff, by definition, the interactions that are left for the human to deal with are going to be more complex, and people are going to have to work in a more collaborative way. So as we start to kind of conclude things, we move to the next slide and start to think about some of the tips that we've seen organizations doing. And the first one is, sounds obvious, manage expectations. And some people have done that. They have put messages out there that, we're experiencing high call volumes. But what they haven't done is then sort of set an expectation around, your average wait time might be 5 minutes, or you're number 10 in the queue, or there's a comfort message, or there's an option for people would you like us to call you back later today? Or those type of things, haven't really potentially been done that well by some organizations. There's been a blanket message and that's been it. And if we think about proactive outbound notifications, just text messages, things like that, again, all the technology is there. We think about listening to the voice of your customer, and part of that is really understanding the key journeys within your organization. So, the 80-20 rule, what are the key journeys and the key inquiries that people are making? So a bit like the Mont Blanc story, what are the 80% of interactions that you're receiving that cause most of the problem? And then building, a better automated experience around that. Steve mentioned the knowledge base, the use of Alexa, Siri, things like that, natural language understanding and processing. It's really, really key that that's kept up to date. And the best way of explaining that is a little bit like, if you went on to Google and you asked Google, where's the nearest Italian restaurant to me, and you turned up to that restaurant and found it was closed, your confidence in that in Google the next day would be quite a bit less. And it's exactly the same, when you run automated or self-service systems. That knowledge is the crown jewel, and it's key, and it's important that it's kept up to date. Next thing we think about is continuous improvement. Gartner have a kind of a phrase which is all around what they call continuous next, and having a digital twin, but the ability to be able to model and simulate and stress test and adapt these journeys and processes in a digital environment in a way so that you can optimize them before you actually make them live and put them in the field in the hands of your customers is key. And then finally, we touched on this earlier, but every time you put a self-service mechanism or an automated mechanism in there, the first thing you really need to think about is the escape route. How do you build the escape route into things so that if things go wrong, a customer gets stuck, that they're not sat there spinning their wheels getting frustrated? They can escalate quickly to a human who can pick up with all the context that's gone before and help serve that customer. So with that said, we'll just highlight a couple of pieces of information that we've got at Enghouse. We have a platform called Video, and that's being used extensively right now by many of our existing and a lot of new customers. I guess the best way to describe that in 3 words is it's just like Zoom, but it's used a lot in banking and insurance and healthcare. It's very secure, end-to-end encryption. There's free trials for all of that, and there's actually a non-profit offer available as well for if you're in the educational world. We've also got our free trial available on our virtualized cloud contact center platform. So if you're thinking about virtualizing your contact center or parts of it, that's a free trial is out there right now and available. And then finally, in terms of artifacts and assets, things if you want to learn more and educate yourself more, Steve touched on the fact that we're proud to be a sponsor of the Inner Circle Guide to AI and Self-Service. We've worked with ContactBabel for many years, and I think when you look at the research that Steve was able to present earlier on this session, you can see why we've done that. The research is detailed, in depth, and couldn't be more up to date if you tried. We've also got guides on self-service, ebooks and videos and all the case studies and good stuff that I mentioned earlier on in that presentation. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Astrid, and I think she's going to open it up to some questions.
Yes, thank you. Thank you both, Jeremy and Steve. I've got a few questions from the audience that I will ask now. The first one is, what is your best tip to get self-service going? Jeremy, maybe you want to pick this up?
Yeah, so I think, the starting point with any conversation about self-service is really understanding, mapping out what are the top 3 journeys that drive kind of customer satisfaction or dissatisfaction, customer retention or profit. What are the journeys that drive cost within your business? What customer interactions cost your company a lot to sort out, and what customer-free journeys expose you to the most regulatory risk? If you're a bank or whatever. Once you've got a handle on, what are those journeys, now you can start to think about, the demographic, the profile of your customer, the type of organization you are, and then you can start to layer in the right technology to solve that problem. But what I would say is, for most people, there are some real quick, easy wins out there. Just putting a "would you like us to call you back" message if the hold queue's gone beyond 5 minutes is a real good way of reducing the queue, maintaining customer satisfaction, and smoothing out the curve, if you like, of the inbound call volume. So there are a lot of things, proactive outbound text messages, posting stuff on your website and the FAQs. All of these things are really quite cheap and easy and quick to do. So getting this working doesn't need to be, as complex. It can be iterative, and it can just be done step by step.
Can I jump in there and add something? I think one of the, I won't say the biggest things, but certainly an easy thing to do is, if you have implemented some sort of self-service, is to publicize it through other channels. So, website pop-ups, IVR announcements, SMS. Even getting agents at the end of a call to say, "Oh, by the way, you could have done this yourself, and this is how you do it next time." And making it really accessible and obvious on the website. Certainly more so than perhaps the phone number or email address. And looking at a bit of AI as well, I think I touched on this a little before. You start simple with chatbots, have a simple use case rather than trying to throw the kitchen sink at it to begin with. That's the best thing to do. When we start talking about AI, then some people who aren't enormously technically minded might think, oh well, in fact that's just, they have this idea of like a row of robots all working there and nobody working in the contact center, but that's not what it's there for. And it's not just about call deflection as well, it's also about kind of decreasing the time to handle for agents as well. And all of this impacts upon your customer experience metrics too.
Mm-hmm. I've got a very interesting question here asking, how do you support customers who are hard to reach or don't access technologies to self-serve?
Well, yeah, it's an interesting one. I think when you looked at the graph that Steve put up when he showed the sort of demographic split of people using web self-service, which was sort of Steve's example of the airport kind of check-in, it was actually fairly evenly distributed. I think the reality is, if you haven't got people, if people's primary point of or channel of communication with you is going to be the phone, and they're not particularly digitally savvy, then you are going to be pretty much limited to using things like IVR, traditional IVR. But then I guess when you looked at the example with Ringo, you can still do an awful lot, with a conventional IVR. You can still do quite a lot, with proactive outbound text messages. And I think when we talked about self-service on this session, we talked a lot about using, knowledge management, NLU, NLP to support the end customer. But we haven't really talked about the fact we see a lot of organizations use it internally. That same knowledge base is used internally to upskill agents. So, for example, we may have a technology, called real-time speech analytics, but that will listen to a phone conversation in real time, understand just like a human would what's being said by both parties. But it will then in the background go off and interrogate that knowledge management system and pull up additional information that can help the agent resolve that customer's inquiry in real time. So basically just give them that little bit of extra technical help or support and questions to ask the customer to try and, as Steve said, get to that most important goal of first call resolution.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just add something to that and say, yes, let's be realistic about this. You're never going to get something that's perfect for 100% of the customers 100% of the time. But the fact is, if you're taking away a lot of the stuff you don't need to have as live, and giving those to customers who would actually prefer to use automation and be on their way rather than talk to somebody, then that obviously frees up a lot of spare capacity for those people who, for whatever reason, really need to talk to somebody.
Yeah. Thank you. I've got another question touching upon corporate buy-in. The question is, how do you get, or do you need it in the first place, a corporate approach?
Well, I would say, from the experience of the organizations that we've worked with, when you've got, corporate buy-in, i.e. senior management buy-in to this, things tend to work quicker and better. What I would say is it's not really that difficult to articulate a business case to senior management of the benefit of this, because most senior management are interested in improving customer satisfaction and retaining existing customers. Most senior management are interested in, operational efficiency. And most of the sort of contact center, call center operation people that we speak with don't really want their people tied up, like the Mont Blanc case study, just doing the same thing again and again, telling somebody this is where you get the cartridge for your pen. They want to use people for the higher level, more sophisticated, nuanced customer interaction problems that need that kind of emotional intelligence. So we don't find it, put it this way, corporate buy-in definitely helps, senior management definitely helps. Yeah, we've not seen too much resistance to it. I think probably the main gap is people's perception is it's more complex to do this than it actually is.
Yep, if I can jump in there. This is literally a question that we asked to senior customer experience directors. So rather than contact center operational people, like a lot of our stuff is, it was senior CX directors said basically, here's a long list of technologies, business processes, etc. that you might like to consider. What's going to be the most important for your business in the next 3 years? And the number one was AI-enabled self-service. So there is certainly, at the very least, a great deal of interest here. I do think, the expectations, as I've said before, have to be managed. Just because something's got AI in it doesn't necessarily mean that, you're looking at superhuman robots. Start easy, find a use case that works for you and kind of expand it out from that. And I think one of the challenges might be to kind of, temper the expectations and beliefs of the senior executives as to what this can actually do. But, obviously, if you keep, do one success and then build on top of that, it's a lot easier than, throwing the kitchen sink at it to begin with.
Mm-hmm. If you have time for another question, somebody wanted to know if there are any obvious GDPR implications managing customer data using virtualization and agents working from home or offshore.
Well, I can jump in and offer my opinion. I'm sure Steve's probably got more insight than me, but I would say, the process that most organizations follow when they sign up a new customer in terms of accepting terms and conditions and, making or acceptance of that company's privacy policy. That privacy policy is, whilst it uses a lot of standardized GDPR text, if you like, it is personalized to your organization. So you can specify, by that customer becoming a customer, they are giving you express consent for XYZ. And part of that consent would be, for you to be able to be handled in that way. I mean, clearly, if data is moving, cross geographies. So when we talked about virtualizing contact centers and virtualizing systems, if data is being passed, for example, outside of the EU, you need to make people pretty aware of that. But I think most organizations, it's fairly standardized text that gets used in customer sign up. But I'll let Steve answer. I'm sure he's probably
I must
more.
admit, this isn't now. Sorry to say, this isn't one of my areas of expertise at all. All I can add to this is kind of anecdotal thing that I talked to somebody with about PCI side of things, and they said that some of the UK businesses who used offshore operations, they weren't wildly enthusiastic about those offshore operations, them doing remote working for the the possible securities around remote working. But really, I don't have anything to add apart from that.
Thank you. I think that brings us to the end of our webinar. Many thanks to Steve and to Jeremy for leading the discussion today. I apologize for a few of the technical hiccups. I hope it didn't spoil your experience. A stable internet connection seems to be one of the main challenges for me working from home, but I still hope you found our discussion valuable. And I will be following up with an email sending you the link of the recording and the presentations. And with that, I conclude our webinar today. I wish you all a fantastic day. Stay safe and take care.